We have now come to the Gospels. We are approaching the birth of Christ. And so let us talk about the Gospels. First of all, the term gospel means good news. And the good news is that Christ has come, he has done his Father's work, he has performed the atonement so that sin can be forgiven. He has defeated death and hell and reigns at his Father's side. That is the good news. And so the gospel, the term, has been given to those accounts that tell us about his mortal ministry and atonement. That's what the Gospels are. There are 4 Gospels in the New Testament that we have. There are many other Gospels that were written, and we have records of them, but they were not included in the New Testament, and unless we have a modern prophet declare them to be Scripture, they are what we would call apocryphal, and so may have good information in them, but likely has a lot of error. Even the Gospels we have in the New Testament have a lot of error. That is why we have the Joseph Smith translation. And he made a whole lot of corrections in the Gospels, which we will read as we read through them. Now, the Gospels, as we have them, are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In the New Testament, in the King James, they are titled the Gospel according to St. Matthew, or the Gospel according to St. Luke. Joseph Smith corrects even the title of these books, and instead of having it rendered as the Gospel according to St. Matthew, it is the Testimony of St. Matthew. I think it's a much better title. So we have the Testimony of St. Matthew, the Testimony of St. Mark, the Testimony of St. Luke, and the Testimony of St. John. Now all these books have some things in common, and they have some things that are unique. The 3 that are most similar, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, these are known as the Synoptic Gospels. The term synoptic means seeing alike. In other words, telling the same story, seeing the same thing. That's what synoptic means. Of course, they do not see these things in the same order. The Gospels are not written in an exact chronological order. Each of the authors had a purpose in writing, and in order to fulfill that purpose, they wrote in a certain way. And the events were not always presented in exactly chronological order. They were presented in the order that would best fulfill the purpose of the writer. So let us go through each of these just a little bit, talk about the author a little bit and what they were writing for. Of course, starting with Matthew. Matthew is one of the 12 apostles of Christ. He was a tax collector. He was a Jew, and he most likely worked under Herod Agrippa, collecting taxes for Herod Agrippa, who was the Roman tetrarch over the area of Judea, or maybe it was Galilee. Anyways, he is called as a tax collector. There is some discrepancy here in that I believe it's in Luke, he is called Levi, and in Matthew, he is called Matthew. And the theory is, the speculation is, that his name was originally Levi, and it was changed to Matthew when he became an apostle. Now Matthew, he is clearly a well-educated man in the Old Testament because he is the one that is constantly quoting the Old Testament. He will write, this happened and this is in fulfillment of this prophecy of Isaiah or of this prophet or just of what is written in the scriptures. So he clearly knew the Old Testament. He clearly knew Jewish scripture. He even makes some quotes that don't exist in our current Old Testament, so he probably had access to records that we no longer have. He was clearly a well-educated man in Jewish tradition. And his audience is clearly the Jews. He is writing to the Jews to persuade them that Christ is the promised Messiah. There are some who look at his writing, and they divide it into 5 parts, where you have the action followed by a sermon, and then an action followed by a sermon, and they divide it into these 5 parts, thinking that Matthew was mimicking the 5 books of Moses as a way of further emphasizing Jesus as the promised Messiah. Now, according to tradition, Matthew, after preaching in Jerusalem and Judea area, eventually made his way down into Africa, specifically into Ethiopia, where he baptized, converted the daughter of the Ethiopian king. And as the Catholic tradition goes, she became a nun, and when her uncle became the new king, he wanted to marry her, and Matthew publicly chastised him for desiring to marry a nun, for which he had Matthew killed. I don't think that is true because nuns did not exist. There were no nuns in the first century. So that's the story of Matthew. Next we go to Mark. Mark was also a Jew. It is believed that he was one of the 70 that Christ called. And we'll read about that in the book of Luke. But Christ, besides his 12 apostles, he ordained 70 other ministries, and it is believed that Mark was one of these 70. Now, he is also sometimes identified with a man called John Mark, and sometimes they are thought to be separate people, but Mark is most likely the one mentioned in Acts as an early traveling companion to Paul, but he would later become a companion to Peter, according to tradition. And as Peter journeyed to Rome, where Peter would eventually be martyred, and the idea is that Mark would collect or write from dictation the words of Peter, so that the idea is that the Gospel of Mark was written under the direction of Peter. Either Mark is collecting Peter's words as he is teaching the saints, or he is being told what to write by Peter. He is acting as scribe of Peter. Whether that is true or not doesn't really matter. The book was written to the Gentiles. It was written to those in Greece and Rome. And it is a very fast-paced, it has less of the sermons, more of the action. It also has the least amount of unique material. It's like only 10% of it is unique to Mark. The rest of it is all shared with the other Gospels. But it is also believed to be the first of the Gospels written with Luke and Matthew borrowing heavily from it in their writing. Now Mark, after Peter is martyred, Mark goes down to Africa. Some traditions hold that Mark was born in Africa. He was a Jew from Africa who was converted in Judea during the Passover. And he returns to his home in Africa. He eventually goes to Alexandria in Egypt, and he sets up the church in Alexandria, becoming the first bishop of Alexandria. But the Alexandrian government and priests there, the pagan priests, are rather upset with Mark for drawing the people to this new Christian religion, and so they take him, they tie a rope around his neck, and drag him through the streets of Alexandria until he dies. And that is Mark's martyrdom. Now Luke, we have a little bit more information about. We know that he was a doctor, he was a physician. Paul tells us that. He was a common traveling companion of Paul, at least in the Acts, which was written by Luke. When it speaks in the first person, says we did this and we did this and we went there, we can assume that Luke is talking about himself as the traveling companion of Paul in those passages. It is thought and generally believed that Luke was from Syria, just north of the Israelite area of Syria. And some people think he was a Hellenized Jew, which means he was Jew by birth, but Greek by culture. But I think it's funny, they did a DNA test on some bones that are believed to be Luke's bones, and according to the DNA, it was all Syrian. I don't know if I actually don't really believe it. I'm not sure that you would be able to find Luke's bones, but you know, it's a fun little note. Now, some people also believe there's the tradition that he was also one of the 70 ministers called by Christ. I doubt that. I think if he was a Syrian, then he was not converted until after Christ's death. Because before Christ's death, when Christ in his mortal ministry, he never taught anybody who was not an Israelite. He did teach the Samaritans, but the Samaritans are of Israelite descent. They're kind of a blended race. So he never went out of the house of Israel. And Luke, being a Syrian instead of a Jew, he would have been outside of Christ's ministry. But after Christ's death, and especially a few years later, when Peter takes the gospel to Cornelius and opens the ministry to the Gentiles, then we could have Luke being converted. And I don't think Luke is mentioned in the book of Acts before that time. He is mentioned in a couple of Paul's epistles as well, but they would have also dated to after the time that Peter opened the ministry to the Gentiles. But he became a close traveling companion of Paul. It is believed that he was with Paul in Rome when Paul was in his final imprisonment in Rome, and that's when he wrote the book of Acts. Most likely wrote the Gospel and the book of Acts during that time in Rome. Also with Luke, got to mention that he apparently was a very well-educated man, not just in the Gospel, but he was educated in the Greek literary tradition. There are apparently quotes from Plato, Aesop, Aristocles, various other well-known Greek authors of the day. And this is why we get the impression, anyways, that his primary audience is the well-educated class of the Greek society. He's not just writing to the Gentiles, he's writing to the philosophers and the scholars. And he's showing them that Jesus is God. Luke lived to be 84 years old, and according to some traditions, he was eventually hung for his belief. So he also died as a martyr. Not everybody agrees with that. That's one tradition. He may have just died of old age. Now those are the synoptic gospels. Let us talk about John. He's the odd man out. Because like Mark was only 10% unique. Matthew and Luke shared a lot of stuff with Mark. On the other hand, John is 90% unique. And remember, Matthew wrote to the Jews. Mark wrote to the Gentiles in Greece and Rome area. Luke was also writing to the Gentiles. The other three are all trying to convince non-believers that Christ is God. John is writing to members of the church. He is writing to those who already believe and settling certain points of doctrine and kind of reminding them of the truth of Christ. And in this way, he is also writing to us in the modern day, showing modern Christians the truth about Christ and preparing them for the second coming. Of course, John is one of the 12 apostles. Not only one of the 12, he was one of the top three. Peter, James, and John were the first presidency of their day. They were the ones that, even when the other apostles were excluded from certain events, Peter, James, and John were generally always there. They were there at the Mount of Transfiguration. These were the three top dogs. Other than Paul, we have more writing from John than we do from anybody else in the New Testament times. John wrote the Gospel. He wrote 3 epistles. He also wrote the book of Revelation. After Christ's death, John traveled a lot in the Israelite area and up into the Syria and the Asia Minor area. His book, the Revelations, is a letter written to the 7 churches of Asia, meaning the area of Turkey, the Asia Minor area. In his later life, he is banished to the island of Patmos, and that's where he kind of disappears from history. He is the only one, Christians in general agree that he's the only one that did not die a martyr's death. What most Christians don't realize is that John never died. We know from modern revelation that John remained on the earth. He was given the gift that he would not die until after Christ returned. But he does kind of fade out of history. He kind of, just like we read in the Book of Mormon with the 3 Nephites who were given the same gift. After a while, the world becomes too wicked, and God withdraws the 3 Nephites. He pulls them out of the world. He probably did the same with John, and John just faded out of history. Now, modern scholars love to debate and want to deny the authorship of all 4 Gospels. They want to say, it was an anonymous writer like 100 years later that wrote Matthew. Mark is, maybe the guy that wrote it was named Mark, but he probably wasn't the guy mentioned in the New Testament. It was a different Mark. They have like 3 different Johns that they want to credit with writing the writings of John, although a lot of people don't even want to credit those 3 with being the authors. So there's a lot of dispute among modern scholars. They want to deny the authorship because if they can weaken the credibility of the testimony. If we have Matthew, Mark, and John, who are all 3 either apostles or members of the 70, ordained by Christ as ministers, we've got good, solid witnesses here. But if we can say that these were anonymous authors who lived 50, 60, or 100 years later, well, then they're not good, solid witnesses anymore. Now we can just claim that they're writing down the traditions. They're collecting the ideas and the philosophies of different groups of Christians, and we can divide them up. It's like Matthew, he's like the Essenes Jews. They're their little conclave of kind of half Jew, half Christian, and he's trying to bring them together into unity. And then we can say that John was a kind of Asian type guy, and he was more of a Gentile who was trying to start his own. And we can fracture things up in this way, and we reduce the credibility of these witnesses, of these testimonies. But we know the authors because God has revealed it to us. In the modern day, we know God revealed it through Joseph Smith that Matthew did in fact write Matthew. Mark did write Mark. Luke did in fact write Luke. John did in fact write John. On a final note, in reading through the Gospels, this is going to be jumping around a lot because as I mentioned at the beginning, these are not written chronologically. And so the same event that is recorded in the 3rd chapter of Luke might be recorded in the 15th chapter of Matthew. and they might be in the 8th chapter of John. Now, in the appendix that is printed with the Bible by the church, there is an attempt to line up the events in the Gospels in a chronological order. It's the best we got, and that's what I'm going to follow in my reading. But this also means that I'm going to be reading, instead of reading a chapter in Matthew and then reading a chapter in Luke and that, I'm going to be reading the same story as recorded in each of the Gospels in a single video. So we may read 5 verses in Matthew, 3 verses in Mark, 2 verses in Luke, because that's how much time they give to that same story. And in the next video, we'll again do that same thing. Some stories are a little bit longer and they're given a little bit more detail, like Matthew might have 20 verses for one story, and then Mark and Luke have 5 verses each. Well, then I'll read Matthew as one video, and then we'll read the parallel accounts in Mark and Luke as another video. And so we're going to be skipping around a lot in this way. It's going to be a little confusing. Now, when we read Matthew as a whole, we get Matthew's message, what Matthew is trying to tell us. When we read Luke, we get what Luke is trying to tell us, and so on. But when we read it chronologically, we start seeing things that would not be noticed because they weren't part of the intended message. They weren't part of what was being communicated, but they are underlying everything. And that's what we're looking for here. When I read chronologically, that's what I'm looking for. That underlying knowledge, understanding that informs everything else. So we're going to have a fun time with the gospel.